Hey YouTube, Vinny M here, and welcome to another video here on the channel. Today we have another World War II reenacting informational video for you, and in today's video we're going to be doing part 1 in a 4-part series on period correct tobacco products for World War II reenacting and living history. Part 1 is going to be about cigars, part 2 is going to be about cigarettes, part 3 is going to be about tobacco accessories, and part 4 is going to be about pipe tobacco and pipes. Be sure to tune in to each part in this 4-part series to have a good overall grasp and understanding of tobacco products during the Second World War. Now, the whole point of this series is not for me to tell you that you can't use a certain pipe tobacco or you can't use cigars at a reenactment because you don't see that many of them in period photos or anything like that. There's a lot of units and reenactors that will tell you you can't do this and you can't do that, and cigars, the topic of this video, is probably one of the most argued about tobacco items in World War II reenacting because a lot of people want to argue that it's not period correct. At the end of the day, it is a hobby. It's there for you to have fun. A lot of people want to get away from their stressful lives, enjoy reenacting, and in doing so enjoy some high-end tobacco products while they're doing it. And I'm not going to take that away from anybody because I do a stressful job and understand how beneficial that can be. So the purpose of these videos are going to be to tell you how to take whatever tobacco product you want and get it to be as period correct as possible. So with that said, and without further ado, let's jump into cigars. So, the biggest issues with cigars between the World War II time period and today is that the way that they are banded and the locations they are made have changed a lot. So back then, we had a lot of Cuban cigars that were available, and today, at least if you live in the US, Cuban cigars are not available. So a lot of those companies, such as Romeo y Julieta, which is in front of you, and La Aroma de Cuba, which is in front of you, have another completely independent, not connected brand of that cigar made outside of Cuba. So the Dominican or Nicaragua or somewhere like that, so that they can be imported under that brand name, but they are not Cuban cigars. With that, we have seen huge changes in the actual bands of the cigars. So back in the World War II time, we didn't have bands that were so embossed, although there was some embossing, and we didn't have bands that were so ornate and so detailed. So when you buy cigars and you want to use them in a World War II reenactment or a living history, what can you do about that, right? Well, the biggest thing people will tell you to do is just take the bands off of them. My issue with that is I like to take a lot of different brands of cigars and I'll have them laid out where like the public can see them. So that would mean I have to take all of my bands off because they might be laying on a table or something like that just around the camp. And if I do that, then I can't tell which one is which. So in my opinion, that's not the best option by any means. The other thing that you can do is you can take and you can print some period correct labels off of the internet and then replace your bands with those. The problem is then you don't actually get the embossed texture or the actual gold leaf inlay that they have, so they just don't look real. So the best option is to just buy brands of cigars that look like they're from the period. But if everything I have in front of you isn't correct for the period because it's too big, too ornate, too defined, or too modern, well, what is correct? Let's have a look. We'll start with the cigars that were favored by Winston Churchill. Here is the La Corona that was made for him. These are surviving cigars from his personal collection, and here they are in the box that's confirmed to have been his. These are Cuban cigars. Notice they say Habana at the bottom. Here is a surviving Winston Churchill La Aroma de Cuba, also labeled as Habana, which basically means it's a Cuban cigar. Here we have a Macanudo labeled as being Jamaican, also a surviving cigar of Winston Churchill's. Here we have a few German cigars. This is a box that belonged to Hermann Göring. You can just see how those differ in their labeling, and yet another box belonging to Hermann Göring. I do not know where these cigars were made. Here's a more generic German brand, Glutentag. And here we have an advertisement from the period for Macanudo out of Jamaica and Punch out of Cuba, both being the same company. And what you have to understand is that today in the US market, you will have Punch cigars that are made by companies that can sell to the US, but there's still a company in Cuba making Punch cigars. So most of these companies have two separate brands, one for Cuba and one for the US market. Here we have a Punch Macanudo advertisement from the time period again. Here we have an H. Upmann Habana. They still make these today in Cuba, but there is an H. Upmann that is made in, I believe, the Dominican for the US market. So I need you to understand that there are two different companies for most of these. Here we have White Owl, which was a prominent brand in the United States. They still exist today, but they're not really true cigars anymore. And here we have an advertisement for La Corona Corona. Here we have a surviving box of Partagas cigars. These are Cubans. And then here we have a surviving box of Romeo y Julieta Cubans. This company today is prominent in the US, but that's a different branch yet again. And here we have another advertisement for La Corona and the Corona size. And here's that same band in color on a surviving cigar from the time period. Again, this is a Cuban cigar. So now that you've seen what actual World War II cigar bands look like, you can instantly pick up the issues with the modern bands. While there are some pretty ornate World War II bands, they don't have the level of embossing on them that the modern ones have, nor do they have the definition of color and the clarity of the actual words and such. So when you see something like this now, after having seen real World War II bands, you see just how out of place this is. Now, I mentioned throughout the slides there that the word Habana means that it's a Cuban cigar. And some eagle-eyed viewers might say, well, there's cigars in the US that say Habana on them that aren't Cuban. Well, you'd be right, but you'd also be wrong. So those cigars are actually Habano, not Habana. So if it's Habana with an A, then it should mean it's Cuban. If it's Habano with an O, it means something different. This Insidious Asylum Habano is a Cuban seed tobacco grown outside of Cuba. One of the companies that I'm most familiar with doing this is Perdomo. That would be this company right here. Now, this is not a Habano, but I can explain to you how Perdomo makes Habano cigars, and it's pretty much the same for everybody. Habano means that the seeds of the tobacco came from Cuba. So Perdomo will buy tobacco seeds from Cuba and then take them to their fields in Esteli, Nicaragua. They will grow the tobacco there, they will harvest it, and they will make their cigars in their factory in Esteli, Nicaragua. And then they will import those cigars to the United States to be sold as Habano cigars. And what that means is that it is a Cuban seed tobacco, but it was not grown in Cuba, and it was not made in Cuba when they made the cigar, so you can sell it in the United States. So it's a way of getting Cuban tobacco sold in the US. But it's still not quite the same as true Cuban tobacco because it was a Cuban seed still grown elsewhere. So that's one of those quirky little things about the cigar industry you need to understand. There are so many quirks about the cigar industry, especially revolving around those import restrictions with the US, that I couldn't possibly explain it in this video, so I'm just explaining it as it comes up throughout the video. So now that we have seen what period bands look like, let's have a look at what still exists today that looks close enough to pass for a period band. So here we have that confirmed surviving H. Upmann Habana cigar from the 1940s. This is a Cuban-manufactured H. Upmann cigar. Now, in Cuba, you can still get these labeled almost exactly like this, but that's not the case in the U.S. However, in the U.S. market, we can get this cigar, the H. Upmann 1844 Reserve, which has an extremely similar band to the original. Here we have White Owl, that brand that was somewhat prominent in the U.S. during the time period. And while certainly not exact, the Henry Clay line of cigars has a pretty similar band to the White Owl of the time period. Now, these are the Winston Churchill La Coronas, which were made for him. And if you look, this band right here, which was the standard band, is available today in Cuba, but not available to the U.S. market. And that is also the case with these Protagas cigars, this being an original surviving box from the period. And this cigar is available today in countries that sell Cuban cigars. So in the U.S. market, unfortunately, we are limited by our import restrictions as to what we can get. If we could get actual Cuban manufactured cigars, there would be a lot more period correct options than there are. But with what we are stuck with in the U.S. market, the Dominican made and Nicaraguan made cigars and such, this is just what we have to work with. As you can see, there are brands that existed during the Second World War that you can still buy today with period correct bands, although you're more limited in the United States than you are in countries where you can get the ones actually made in Cuba. Now, that was a short list. I didn't include all the options that are out there. You're going to have to do a little bit of research on your own if there's a specific brand that you enjoy, and see what you can find from that brand that will allow you to use it in the reenacting scene, if you will. One of the brands that I didn't show there because I wanted to dive just slightly deeper into is Romeo y Julieta. Romeo y Julieta, as already mentioned, was a prominent brand with Winston Churchill. As a matter of fact, some sources credit Romeo y Julieta with actually creating the Churchill length cigar in his honor. Now, Romeo makes this cigar right here, which is called the Clemenceau, which is actually the size of the cigar. You don't hear Clemenceau very much anymore. This is a Toro-sized cigar by today's standards. If you don't have any clue in hell what I'm talking about, cigar sizes have names. So a 5-inch cigar is a Robusto, a 6 is a Toro, a 7-inch is a Churchill, and there are others. So this tubo, meaning it comes in a tube, Romeo Clemenceau, has a period correct band on it. Now, I don't know if this is correct for Romeo, but this exact band is seen on other brands of cigars, and you've already seen it in this video. This is a very simple band. It is a gold band with black Romeo y Julieta wrote on it and embossed rows of dots above and below. Very, very simple band and 100% period correct. Romeo is a little bit hard to nail down exactly what their bands looked like during that time period. We do have bands on cigars from the 1960s from Romeo y Julieta that still exist that look no different than they do today. So it's pretty clear that Romeo y Julieta has not changed their marketing, at least from the 1960s until now, so you would think they didn't change it from the 1940s to the 1960s either. That's probably a safe bet. But we do know that Romeo y Julieta did not put any bands on their cigars in the 1930s because existing boxes of those cigars have no bands. So, unfortunately, no matter what brand you select, you might have to kind of make an educated guess because you might have some information on what they looked like before World War II and after, but not during. And that's what I'm doing here. I choose to use these for World War II reenacting because if I left them laying on a table where the public can see them, they don't look out of place. If I left them where another reenactor could see them, then they don't look out of place. The brand is correct for World War II, and the band is correct for World War II. I just don't know that the brand and the band go together. But here's what I do know about Romeo y Julieta cigars. So I told you that I would tell you what I do know. And what I do know is that the band on the Clemens show is used here on this existing box of La Coronas that is confirmed to have belonged to Winston Churchill, although it does say Cubana number something. Here is a confirmed box of 1933 manufactured Romeo y Julietas, and we know they didn't have bands in the 30s. But here is a photo being used by Romeo y Julieta on their website that allegedly depicts Winston Churchill smoking one of their cigars. And we see it does have a square band, not an oval, although we can't see what the band looks like. Here we see what the band for Romeo y Julieta looked like from 1960 to 1970, and pretty much what it looks like today, at least on their reserve line of cigars. Here is a board depicting the bands of Romeo y Julieta throughout many years, and it doesn't date each one, but we see a huge number of them look exactly like the ones today used on the Bully cigar by Romeo and the Reserve. And here we have a confirmed Cuban band from the 1960s, again sporting pretty much the same exact design. So as you can see, we have to make a little bit of educated guess there. We know what the cigars looked like in the 30s, and we know what they looked like after World War II in the 60s and beyond. And after we start seeing bands put on the Romeo cigars, we don't see a lot of change in what they looked like. So we can use that information to make an educated guess. And as you saw, whether this band was ever used by Romeo before now, it was used by other manufacturers, making it period correct. Ultimately, if you're not going to go with a cigar that looks exactly like it did back then or very close, like the H. Upmann Reserve, then you're going to have to do your own research, draw some conclusions, and do the best you can. And that's what I've just showed you that I've done, and I've showed you how to do it. Ultimately, this has been a long video, probably the longest in the series, just because cigars are very complicated. Just the history behind them and the nomenclature that you use and what things are called and why things exist, especially with the embargoes and such, it just creates a mess. So the other ones should not be this long. I hope you tune in for the other 3 parts of this series. As always, like and subscribe, and have a nice day.